let's get back to our presentation. All right, so my name is Chuck Crandall, and I am presenting on object-oriented programming, kind of doing a very high-level intro to this. This kind of stemmed from a few months ago. We were having a Drupal user group discussion, and the topic was come with your favorite thing about Drupal 8. And I came and was talking about the Drupal services, the new service container, and how fantastic it was. And I started going into a little bit of detail as how it works, and I could see that a lot of the people, or at least some of the people that were there, who were using Drupal quite a bit, had a glazed over look in their eyes, and they didn't understand what a service was, and as we kind of went further back, what a class was, and some of the concepts of object-oriented programming. So I realized that there are many of us who use Drupal who do not have a computer science degree, or who've not done, have not learned all of the intricacies of programming, object-oriented programming being one of those. So really quick, by a show of hands, who has done any, well, actually, let's start off, who's a developer here? Who writes code out of the group? Okay, so most of you that are kind of why you're here. And then who works in Drupal 7? So you're very familiar with the functional approach of Drupal 7. Okay, and then now, how many of you learned PHP and Drupal at the same time? You learned that? That was me. Granted, I was Drupal 4, but it's been a little while. But I figured out PHP and functional programming all at the same time. So when I explain object-oriented programming, I'm not going to go into a lot of the high level or the nomenclature, and this is some of the more in-depth. I'm going to talk this kind of at a lower level and try to understand basically in day-to-day usage how you're going to be using, how we use object-oriented programming in Drupal and in PHP. The other thing I will say is that while this session is an intro to Drupal development, we're not actually talking about Drupal in this session. This one's going to be about PHP and object-oriented programming in general. And then I have an afternoon session where we're going to talk more in depth about some of those other topics specific to Drupal. So as I explained a little bit, some of us who have been doing Drupal for a while, maybe you've done 6 or 7, and you are familiar with how Drupal works as in functional programs. We have those awesome hooks that you can use that get your data and interact with everything else that's in Drupal. And Drupal 7 started introducing some of the concepts in some objects, some classes, but in reality, Drupal 8 is a big leap from where Drupal 7 and 6 and previous versions were. And the reason they did that, and you have to ask, well, things were going pretty smooth with Drupal. Why did they make this huge jump? Why did Drupal become so much more difficult to write a module or to get in there and make changes and things like that. And I really think the difference is Drupal was living in the past with functional programming, and it was easier to use, and all the developers, you could basically teach yourself how to write a module fairly easily without having a lot of programming background and understanding of how things work. But Drupal decided to get off the island and get more mainstream with the rest of the PHP and the software world. And I will say, if you have any questions or any comments or anything like that, I don't enjoy hearing my own voice, so feel free to ask questions, to raise your hand, add anything else. I'm happy to have a discussion here rather than just hear me talk. So anyway, Drupal wanted to get off this island and get more into mainstream. So a few things that they did to adapt or to adopt common technologies was primarily was to pick up PHP Symfony. And Symfony is the kind of the Drupal or the PHP standard right now for development. It is a very well supported and it's an awesome framework, and a lot of PHP development is done in Symfony. Picked up a few other things like Twig, which goes along with Symfony. Twig is your template. If you guys are familiar with PHP template that Drupal used previously, that was kind of a homegrown solution that evolved into its own thing, and it worked. It was great, but it wasn't very clean. It didn't separate your presentation from your logic, and that's what Twig definitely does. So anyway, so let's dive into the object-oriented programming. I won't go too far into other things. So obviously, object-oriented. Object is the key. It's all about objects. And you say, well, that's great. I use objects in 7. I use objects all the time. I write node load, and it returns me a node object. Well, that object is just a dumb standard class object that has nothing but some variable data in it. It's not personalized to node in any way in 7 or 6, or you pull something from the database, it's going to come back as a standard object. What we're talking about is personalizing, customizing these classes, these objects, so that we can have the information, we can have both information and functions and methods off of this class. So a class, I try to think of class, and if you guys have a better definition of any of these things, those of you who are familiar with object-oriented programming, a class is just kind of more of an abstract concept. And we'll actually get into an example in a minute, but if you're talking about shapes, a class can be shape. Shape is a class. But if you get into different objects within shapes, within a shape, you're going to start talking about squares and circles and triangles. Those are instances of this generic concept of a class. So a class basically has 2 components to it. It has variables where you store data, and it has methods or functions. Functions just like you would see in functional programming that you're more familiar with in Drupal 7. And so we create this class of, let's say, shape, and then to get an object, an object is actually an instance of that class. And it's going to have instances of the data and the methods of that class. So let's look at cars. So if we have cars, we have some of the properties of a car. And this is, fresh in my mind because I was doing car shopping for the last week. And you start thinking about, well, I'm comparing all these different features and all these different elements of a car. Well, a car has a body color, it has interior, it's a make and a model. All this is information. These are variables related to this car. But then it also has, there are certain methods or functions around this car that you can look at. You can have methods that just get your information. Well, get me the body color and get me what the condition of the car is in. But then you can also have some logic in there. Calculate the gas mileage. Does this have AC? Does this, let's calculate the depreciation of this car. And it can be, Boolean type things of, does it have this feature or does it not? Or give me a list of the different features for the sound system or whatever it is. So your car is basically broken into these properties, which is your data, your values, and methods, which are going to act on the specific data for that class or for that object. Any questions, or is this making sense? Or also, is this too basic? Am I going? Yeah, so we're doing okay here? Okay. So basically, we have a car. Now we have two instances of car. One is an awesome Ford Pinto, and the other is a Chevy El Camino, which I'm sure most of you have never seen either of those on the road. I really hope those were the two cars you were. I was shopping for it. I wish, like I could find it. I actually drove an El Camino when I turned 16, so that I'm familiar with that one. So we have properties, like we talked about. So, we've defined this car instance as yellow with black interior. It's a Ford Pinto, not a Mustang. It has these certain features, whatever it is. And then another instance of car represents our El Camino. But they're both cars. They're both using the same values, the same variables, and the same methods. They share this. And once I create that instance of the car, then it exists and it doesn't change unless I change it. One of the biggest problems with functional programming is you can have a function that says get car information. But every time you call it, you have to be pulling data from somewhere, or you have to be passing data in. There's no storage involved in that function. Whereas a class is, as an instance, it's storing that information, and you can come back to it anytime you need. All right, so another great thing about classes is that you have a concept called inheritance. So I may have a concept of car, but it inherits some of the properties from a class called vehicle. And under the vehicle, you may also have the concept of truck. And you may have motorcycle and helicopter. I don't know. But So we have this concept of my instance of car is it's a car, but it's also a vehicle, and I can have properties and methods for both. And any property that is on the vehicle at the vehicle level needs to be available to the car and truck. Does that make sense? So moving forward, you say, well, that's great, but we have an El Camino. Is it really a car or is it a truck? It's kind of it's the confusion. So maybe I could have an El Camino instance, and it could be both a car and a truck. But in reality, it doesn't work that way, because it's an instance. So you need to consider your El Camino as a car, but you can separately have an instance under truck if that's how you want to define it. But those are two separate instances. So I hope this is making sense as far as kind of the basic concept. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of the terminology, but when we have this concept of inheritance and parents and children, classes and things like that, it's very helpful when you have in this situation like siblings of car and a truck who both belong to the vehicle class, or both extend the vehicle class, that they have some functions in common. We're going to define the things that they have in common. They both need a function that says get body color, get tire condition, whatever, calculate gas mileage. But they also have things that don't match up. Get trunk space, get payload capacity. That's more specific to the different classes. So object-oriented programming has this concept of an interface. And an interface is basically defining the commonalities across the different classes. So if I have an interface of, or let's say I have a class of car that extends or that implements the vehicle interface, that means that my car has to define get body color, get tire condition, calculate gas mileage, and get max passengers, because that's what my interface says. And the nice thing about this is that you can, later in your programming, you can say, get me a vehicle, and I don't have to care what that vehicle is, whether it's a car or a truck, and I can call, calculate gas mileage. And I know that class, because it defines that interface, I know that class is going to have that function. And I'm not going to run into problems trying to figure out, having to handle each class slightly differently. And that's a very important thing especially when you're getting into a system like Drupal that has so many classes and so much inheritance, almost to a fault, where everything has a base parent class and children and grandchildren and whatever. Yeah. So this is moving pretty quickly. I was expecting a question, at least at some point. So we may have a little time, extra time here. So I'm going to switch over right now. They always say it's a horrible idea to do live programming, but since this is just a demo and we're not actually going to run any code, this doesn't count. So the first thing I will say, in doing object-oriented programming, it really helps to have the right tools. It really helps to have an editor that understands classes, that understands what it's supposed to look like, so that when you get your syntax wrong, it can tell you. That is a big deal. So anyway, are you guys able to see that? Is that too small? Let me see if I can. I don't know how well this zooms in, honestly.
Well, I'll put a plug out for PHP Storm. If you have the education email address, you can. That's awesome.
Really?
Yeah, I second that plug. If you have a student email address, you can
You can get a free pass and trial version.
a what?
You can get a free pass and trial version.
Yeah. So as long as you have an educational email address, you can have it.
Use it for free. Yeah, because I did the trial version, was blown away by it. So.
Yeah, the full version.
It makes all the difference. PHP Storm.
Yeah, it's pretty epic when I tried.
Yeah, because I have used a variety of editors over the years, and I've really liked. I was previously using Sublime, and I thought Sublime was the answer to all my problems because it does a fantastic job for front end development. But once you get into developing modules and writing in object-oriented programming, this is the way to do it, because it catches so many of my little mistakes that I would have spent hours trying to find myself.
Heavily integrates with Git. It heavily integrates with things like your SQL stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and truthfully, I am not a power user of PHP Storm. I only use a small subset of the features, but I can, when I load up my Drupal project, it'll ask me if I open a new one and say, "Is this Drupal?" And I say yes, and then it knows. Okay, well, then I know how Drupal works, and I'm going to start telling you when I can get type hints. I can get I'm typing in services and it knows what those services are and things like that are just huge time savers.
It has a built-in SSH console.
Yeah. So if you walk away with nothing other than that, then it's a success. All right, so we're going to create a class. Now, if you look at this, it's just a PHP file. It has a few things that make it different. And a lot of it is just syntax and kind of getting used to the syntax. Classes are namespaced. A few things in PHP can be namespaced, classes being one of them. Namespaces are basically just organizing your code. It is not just helpful, it is a requirement for module development. You need to have, and there's actually a standard, and I want to say it's PSR 4 or 7 or something like that. There's a standard for how your code is organized to keep things from getting lost in Drupal. So your namespacing in Drupal is going to be very specific. You can open any module and see how it works. In this case, we're just going to have a generic my example namespace. The other thing is when you're using other classes, if they're not in the same folder, then in a functional approach, we would go and write include statements, and we would include this and include that. And with classes and the concept of an auto load, we're basically auto loading everything that we need, but you have to define what you need. So if we're going to be using another class, we're going to use a use statement, and basically saying, I'm going to be using the my example class, or the vehicle class, or the car class, and so pull that into my code. And that's how we can either use statements, or we can skip them and just write out the full path every time we use that class. And I'll actually show that when we get into the other elements there. So define a class. Class, you just write the word class and you give it a title. Coding standards or best practices within Drupal, it's typically first letter capped. And well, yeah. And so we'll just go here. And then what we're going to do is we have a set of variables that we're defining. So in this class, this is just a small subset of our vehicle variables. These are the things that are related to specifically, or to generically, any vehicle. Now, we're leaving this open so that pretty much anyone can call and can create a vehicle class, or you can create a subset, one of your subclasses. The other option is that you can actually declare this vehicle as an abstract class, meaning that you can't create a vehicle class specifically. Vehicle is really only there to provide some of the variables and methods for the subclasses. But we won't get into that right now. So we're going to say, one thing that you'll notice here is that these variables we're defining with a permission. Public, protected, private. That defines who gets to see it. A public variable means that once you have an instance of this class, you can say, class El Camino arrow make, and it's going to tell you the make of that class, that object. However, sometimes you don't want that available. Truthfully, most of the time, you don't want that available. What you want is people to use methods, the get set functions, things like that, to get your information. That way you have more control over what they have access to, and if you want to do any processing on that information before you give it to them. So that's when we do either protected or private. So the difference there is protected means that the public, they can't access this from any object, but you can access this information from a method or a function within the class or within any of the parent classes. Or so it's still, if I have a car class that inherits this vehicle, then I can still access this information. And then private says that it is only specifically available to this class. So basically, we've defined these variables. Then we go in and we start creating our methods. Oops, let's try that again. All right, so classes also have things called magic methods. So I'll use the word methods and functions interchangeably only because we're used to functions, and we actually define things as functions in PHP, even within a class. But in object-oriented discussion, it's usually we call those methods. Within a class, it's a method. So we'll kind of use those interchangeably. Or at least that's how I'm familiar with using them. So we have these magic methods that basically every class has access to. A construct, a deconstruct, meaning as you build this class or this object, this is going to get called every time. As you destroy this object, if you unset or something like that in PHP, that is going to be, deconstruct is going to be called. Yeah?
Why does the construct have the underlines for? Is that just like a standard best practice, or?
That is, so the construct is actually a very specific keyword of a method. So the double underscore basically typically denotes a magic method. So this is specific to PHP. In case you want to create your own something that called construct, then you could, but just if it has the underscore, then it's going to be the magic method.
What I've seen in most cases when I have the double underscore, it represents some sort of event. So like in this case, it's when you actually instantiate the class vehicle, that's going to call that constructor. I think there's a destroy, a couple others that happen in Sigma event.
Yeah, there's a like a toString function. So it's underscore toString. And that's going to basically give you, you can define what's output when your class gets printed or converted into a string. PHP.NET explains the magic methods, all that are available, much better than I could. But they are, the constructor is one that I end up using every class, just about every class. Because when you want to pass information in when you create a class, you do that through the constructor. When in Drupal, when you are using entities and some of these other classes and services and things like that, you're going to pass in your some of the other classes, services, so that you have access to them later. And when we get into Drupal 8, we can actually show what that looks like. In this case, the constructor, maybe we come back because we'll probably have time. We can come back and add something to the constructor and show what that looks like. So anyway, getting into the methods, they function pretty much just like a standard PHP function. The difference is that you're going to call it through this object. And then, most importantly, it has access to all this data within your object that nowhere else may have access to. All right, so here's our vehicle class. Nothing too exciting. The one thing we can do here is we can do some of the heavy lifting, some of the logic, like calculate gas mileage. Well, what does that require? That requires some data storage so that you can go back and say, I traveled this many miles and I filled up this many times, and whatever the logic is to calculate that, you can run that, you can calculate it, you can store it, so that the next time somebody comes along and wants that information, as long as this object, is still around, then you have that available. So that is our vehicle class. Now, as we kind of had our little diagram show, we have the vehicle as a parent, but then we're going to have children classes. So let's go ahead and look at like a motorcycle class. And so the key here is our motorcycle class is going to extend the vehicle class. And that basically means that it is now inheriting all the properties from vehicle. So that when we create a motorcycle objects, we now have access to everything that was defined in vehicle. So you'll notice here in the constructor, it has two variables being passed in. So that means when I create a motorcycle instance, I'm going to give it a make and a model. And then in the actual constructor, it's saving that information in this arrow make. This is a variable that represents the class. So you have access to your methods and your variables and the class itself with the variable this. It's familiar if you've done any of the JavaScript programming, you've probably seen it there. You also notice that make and model on the class are not defined in the motorcycle class. So that means that we're actually defining, this make is actually pulling from vehicle where I've defined make and model. And that's why it has access to that. The one thing to show is if I were to come down here and say, let's create a private variable called year. So this is the year of the car. If I come into the motorcycle and try to say this year, well, it underlines, I don't know if you guys can see that very well, but it underlines it and says there is no variable defined as year. And actually when I hover over it, it's going to tell me specifically that this has private access, that I'm trying to access something that I don't have access to. Whereas if I come back here and change that to protected, it's no longer underlined. It now has access to it, and I can now say that that is a 1976 motorcycle. So here's where I can define my information. I can use information that was inherited from another class. And then I can come in here and write my own functions that are specific to motorcycle. The other thing I can do, let's say we had so calculate gas mileage. Well, let's say we have an electric motorcycle. Then calculate gas mileage doesn't necessarily make sense. Calculate mileage might make sense, but there's no gas. So what we're going to want to do in that case is we're going to want to create a function that overwrites calculate gas mileage, and we're going to return a null or something else. And then we're going to create our own function that makes sense for our specific class. And so quite often with inheritance and the different children and parent classes, you'll have a lot of overwriting and accessing information from one another like that. Any questions on this? Is there anything that you've seen in classes or looking at Drupal that you're kind of wondering how that worked or why that works? Okay, so I'll go ahead and go into the interface. So our motorcycle, it extends vehicle, but we want to make sure that it shares the same functions as our car and our truck classes. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an interface, and an interface is just a PHP class, or not a class, but a PHP file, and it defines an interface. And what you're doing here is you're just saying, here's my name, and here are the functions that can be used for this interface. You don't have to put any logic in here. You don't actually put the function itself, just the name. And basically keep this up to date to whatever your classes are. So as we define the interface, we can see, these are the 4 functions that make sense for our vehicle interface. So when we go into motorcycle, we are going to implement our vehicle, and see, this is the beauty of PHP Storm. Okay, now I know that everything is set up properly, because it wouldn't give me the suggestion of vehicle interface if that wasn't a valid option. So then I can just select that. It's going to give that. Well, great, I selected it, and then it comes up as red. It's underlining it in red, saying you messed up. Well, what did you do wrong? Well, again, PHP Storm can tell me. I hover over it, and it's going to say, well, your class has to declare or declare as abstract or implement these methods. You are not doing get tire condition and get max passengers. So you're not living up to the interface.
Can't you in your interface create default functions so that there's always something returned and then you just overwrite them?
So you can do that in your parent class, like your base class?
Okay, but you can't do that in the interface then.
No, the interface doesn't actually define functions as well. I mean, it doesn't actually implement anything. Structure, exactly. So you'll notice that so our interface has 4 different functions. But our motorcycle doesn't have any of those. And it's only throwing an error on 2 of those. So the other 2 that it's finding, it didn't error on get body color and calculate gas mileage, because those are defined at vehicle. And so as far as it knows, it doesn't care whether it's from a parent, whether it's being inherited, whether where it's coming from. It wants to know that those functions are available. So what we can do is we can go in our motorcycle and create a get tire condition and get max passengers. Again, it's going to help me because it knows that I'm missing that. I can even make it protected if I want to keep it. Actually, I take that back. No, because that's the point of an interface. Because that's defining what is publicly available. So now our interface, well, first off, our red underline is now gone because we no longer have issues. We've completed the requirements of this interface. Everything's checked off. And now we can go in and we can write or overwrite the functions. And we know that any vehicle or any class that implements this vehicle interface is going to have these standard functions, and we can use those in our code. Okay.
So say we added those 2 functions to the motorcycle, but not the vehicle. So the vehicle will have an issue if it tries to implement vehicle interface, right?
Yes.
So then, so say I want to have vehicle interface, but then I want to customize and do motorcycle interface. Can I have motorcycle interface like inherit from vehicle interface? Can you do something like that?
Yeah. Yeah, so you can have a vehicle interface that basically defines, and this is sloppy because you would typically have the interface defining functions for the class that it's interfacing for. So typically you would have all the functions from vehicle interface, they'd be found in vehicle. And then in motorcycle interface, you can define classes, and motorcycle interface can implement vehicle interface. So your motorcycle interface is going to have everything the vehicle has, plus whatever else you define in a motorcycle interface. So you can do that same extension with the interfaces as well as you can with the classes themselves.
So on the interface file, would it just be like send, would it just be like vehicle or vehicle interface extends, or motorcycle interface extends vehicle interface?
Yeah. So vehicle interface right here is going to say, I want to say it's implements, not extends. But I could be wrong. Do you want to take a minute and try that? Let's do that.
PHP store will tell you if you mess it up, right?
Yeah, I just have to have the file, this has to exist. So let's copy that and change. Oops. So my interface, motorcycle interface, is going to implement vehicle. And since it's not type hinting to me, I want to say that might be wrong. Let's try extends. There it goes. Yeah, it is extends. Okay. So we've just extended that. And now we can have everything from vehicle interface. We don't have to redefine here. It's already defined. And then we can just use the create new functions for our motorcycle class. Good question. Any other thoughts or questions on interfaces? Interfaces are extremely helpful when you have multiple classes that are essentially siblings, doing something very similar, and so that you have to share those functions. I personally, and there are, I'm sure, developers who would disagree with me, but I don't feel like every class needs an interface. I feel like there are many classes that are standalone where an interface is not a necessity. But when you get into something like Drupal and you have concepts of entities, well, every entity has an interface because that entity shares a lot of functions with other entities. And there are things like that where interfaces are extremely helpful to make sure that you have access to everything you need. All right, so let's see. Oh. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts on that? So let's look at how we actually use classes in our PHP files. So we're going to have a PHP file where we want to instantiate this motorcycle or this vehicle. So in PHP, we're going to say, our motorcycle is, what we want is a new instance of motorcycle. And you'll see how PHP Storm filled it out for me. It added the my example namespace, because if I just typed in motorcycle, it wouldn't have any idea where to find that. And that's not true. It would look at the global space, at the global namespace, and it wouldn't find it there. But luckily, PHP Storm knew that, so it just filled it in for me. And then I'm going to give a make of Kawasaki and a model of I have no idea anything about motorcycles. So I'm going to say there's an IS400. So now I have an instance of that motorcycle. Now I can say motorcycle. Now look at this. It's giving me all my options. This is everything that's been defined publicly for the motorcycle class. Extremely helpful when you are in Drupal and working with entities, because entities have so many methods and so much available that is really, saves you time searching through Drupal.org trying to figure out what you're looking for. So I can say, well, let's figure out what the tires are. Get tire condition. Well, so that's, I can do that. Truthfully, my class right now doesn't have any logic. That I did not pass that information in, and I didn't calculate it, so it isn't really able to tell me that information. Typically, you would have either an access to a database, or you're defining things in a set tire condition, set model, set make function. And then we can also do a more generic, because we allowed this. We can say, I want a vehicle. And it doesn't have any parameters passed in. And then I can say vehicle get body color. And it wouldn't have anything defined currently. But that function exists. That function is available. So the one thing we can do, we talked a little bit about the use statements. Are we using up our time? Good. Okay. So I will cover use statements really quick, and then we'll be done. So right now, the namespace is kind of taking up the whole, or it's using the full namespace to access these classes. One thing I can do is I can say use my example motorcycle. And so basically I've defined that motorcycle class that I'm going to be using it. So now I can just use it by name. And you'll see that it doesn't give me any errors on that. Very helpful to keep because sometimes the namespaces get very long. So you want to limit those as much as possible. So you use the use statements to take care of that. And the other great thing is when you are in classes in PHP Storm and you start typing, I want to use the vehicle class, it'll automatically add the use statement for you. So you don't actually have to go in and do that. You can just define that I want to use this class, and it'll take care of that for you. Any other questions or anything that was not covered in our discussion? All right. So conclusion, make the jump, do it, go to 8. There's a lot there's a lot of hurdles. There's a pretty steep learning curve to get there, but it's really not as bad as it looks. It's not as scary because you don't have to be a core developer. You don't have to be in there. You can even go in and you can write your own modules and build your own themes. And you don't have to know how everything works yet. So, great. Any other questions or comments? If not, we'll call that a wrap. Thanks. Yeah.
Does it have YouTube?
Yeah, it has it right there.
Aha.
See that?
Yeah, I didn't.
I should find that and stop it.